We've had a question which is, there are a lot of businesses moving to AWS or GCP. Why do you think this is? And are people moving away from Azure? So Richard, I know we spoke about it in the past privately, but what's your sort of opinion on that?
I think people are a bit nomadic. I think people move around. I mean, the different cloud platforms have different capabilities. So Google is really good at some stuff. Azure is kind of quite mainstream and good at things. You know, Azure is, AWS is as well. And if you move for cost, you're shooting yourself in your foot because the clouds are so competitive. For me, like Lauren said before, if you've got a team that's predominantly Microsoft based, you probably want to pick up Azure. It would be an easier entry in. I think Google, you're looking at very specific technologies. I don't think they're really competing with Azure or AWS on all fronts. But yeah, anything very specific that suits your needs. I've kind of found with AWS, the bar is higher for entry. I always think AWS works for larger organizations that have kind of dedicated teams. And for Azure, the entry is lower. The portal is great. You can kind of get into it right the way from bedroom programmer, but it supports right the way up to kind of SMEs and up into large scale organizations. And I know that when you have people who come from AWS, kind of seasoned developers and architects that come from AWS, they actually find Azure quite liberating because you do have a view of what's in there. You can see a lot more, and there's a lot more that's immediately available to you. But I do think it does depend on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. But I can guarantee you, if you've got 10 organizations leave AWS, there'll be 10 that are leaving Azure and 10 that are joining Google, and people are always up and down. The trend has been more and more people are joining Azure over the last few years.
Cool. No, that sounds perfect. Lawrence, we're going to start the next question with yourself. This is the longest I've not heard you speak. I've known you. So it's on costing. So where do you start with costing? Is that from the business or from the customer?
From my perspective, I'll talk from my perspective. I have, a number of customers, and I know how much data I've got, and I know I can measure how much traffic there is. So once I get those kind of metrics, I start to look at, right, if I were to use these selection of services, and some of the Microsoft formula are somewhat entertaining. Go and play with the Azure calculator. It's hilarious. But you can get a feel for it and exactly how much you can start predicting how much over a 6 to 12 month period you can start working, right, okay, if I have 14 containers, if I suddenly burst up to 24 containers, how much is that going to change? What is my maximum going to be? And that can give you an idea, more of an idea of exactly how much you're going to work at. You need to get yourself a spreadsheet together and start looking at all those services that you want to use. Remember I talked about managing diversity? Yeah, you don't want your spreadsheet to be too complicated because it's too hard. But you do need to start using that spreadsheet to really drive down into number of people, number of transactions, amount of data, amount of transactions that you're moving through the platform. That really does. The question of do you ask the customers or do you ask the business? Well, what's the difference? It depends. If you're talking about a cloud environment for running a business as a client, the business is both of those things. For me, I looked at the data I've got to process, and then I worked out if I could afford it because I've got licenses. Then you got to look at, are you going to go transactionally based costing, or are you going to go per seat based costing, or are you going to look at asset priced costing? So how do you charge your customers if you're selling this as a software as a service to someone? And those things can change dramatically. You've got high asset costs but low transaction rates. You're not going to want to charge them by transaction. You're going to want to reverse that and look at asset based pricing. In other words, how much money are they putting through your system? You've also got, in my world, you've got the integrations. If you're integrating with other services and other providers and doing that sort of API ecosystem, you've got to really think about that, because you've got to not only cost the data going through it, but maintaining it and enabling and changing versions. People upgrade. And then you have to upgrade because they've upgraded because you're using their service and your customers are expecting that all to work. So there are different ways of looking at there. Again, there's always variables. Richard was doing a good example of exactly how many variables there are. Track out those variables about the things that will impact the cost. And then you can start applying that to the use of the resources.
And I think what you said before, Lawrence, is exactly right. You look at one of the resources, so you deploy API management, for example, and you think that's great, and then you realize actually you need to scale up the security on that, and it's not a 10% change. So I think you need to understand what your security looks like and what your resilience looks like, so you can build that into your pricing up front. Otherwise, it can be a really horrible shock.
A good example of that is the DDoS protection within Azure, which there is DDoS protection as standard on anything, on any tenancy. But if you want to add and get your customers are demanding you add extra stuff, it's intensely expensive. And you've got to you've got to put 25, 50K in just for a line for that.
Brilliant. Cheers, guys. One from Garrard that I wanted to ask as well is, what have you found as the main reasons for initial failure to migrate? So Richard, do you want to start off?
I think probably naivety, I think, on behalf of the IT team and the organization. I do think I've seen so many projects where they've gone, hey, look, we've built all this, it's up in the cloud, and the business thinks that's it, it's done, it's ready, because they don't understand how it's deployed and where it's deployed. I think that happens all too often, and I think that's a bit of naivety on the IT team and the business. I think you wouldn't do that if you were building out a new office. You wouldn't go, look, it's there, there's no desks, there's no networking, you know, there's no drinks machines, whatever it is. You walk around the office and go, yeah, it's done. And I think it's the same with the cloud. There's so many things that you need to have in there to make it into a platform that you can deploy into that people don't realize.
That distinction of a platform, everybody thinks that it's just a bunch of applications inside Azure. No, Azure is a platform upon which you build another platform.
Right. I've got one here as well. Is it best to utilize and upskill your internal team or outsource the migration to a consultancy or third party? You could maybe add to that as well.
It depends where you want the IP. You know, IP is incredibly important. Do you want to be beholden to a third party? You bring in a bunch of hotshots, they create your system that you've got to maintain going forward and then leave. Or you run out of money because they cost you a lot. You probably need to do a mixture, I would suggest. The way I've done it in variety of ways, I ensure that there's two things you don't outsource: analysis and, well, three: product, analysis, and architecture. Sorry, Richard. But you need that information, because if you don't have that, you lose power and you lose that IP. A bunch of programmers, a bunch of testers, yeah, outsource them, as long as they're following some very defined patterns. You do not want to give them free rein, because they will own you.
Rick, anything you'd like to add on that as well?
Yeah, I tend to work with people, Lawrence.
I'm just saying.
I know, that's fine. No, I mean, I completely agree. It depends if you want to build up your team to take something forwards, or if you're happy to have it done for you. And that's completely up to the business and the context around that. I mean, both are perfectly viable options. Me personally, I always think it's better to build up your team, because you've got the skills in-house to maintain that, and you're usually making your internal staff happier by giving them new opportunities. But then you also need to put the governance and the frameworks in around that to enable them to do that properly.
I actually, one of the things we did, we got an accelerator company in and we embedded them. So this wasn't just a set of individual independents. This was a specific company that with with an aim to upskill as fast as possible the team inside and give them the skills to be able to take it forward.
I think it all depends as well in terms of the organisation you're in at that stage and how quick it has to be built as well. Yeah. So I think there's a number of factors to take consideration there when maybe looking at engaging a consultancy or a third party. But no, appreciate that. I've got one here. What are your top guiding principles for migration?
Richard, do you want to?
Mine would be don't lift and shift. I think that would be my top one. I think I would evaluate what it is that you want to migrate up into the cloud, and I guess understand things like your timescales and your appetite for making changes and how easy it is to do. But I would always try and target a solution in the cloud as opposed to just lift and shift something.
Yeah. As I said, I have 10 sort of principles, and you've got to consider, they're things such as consider the customer. Who is it you're building for? So make sure that you're building not for a bunch of techies, but for somebody who's going to use this thing. The management of technical diversity is very important, but also speed to value. If you build your pipelines right, you need to get a change out there very quickly. If you don't build those pipelines right, it'll still take you too long. So there's a whole set of things there that you need to really think about. And having that set of guiding principles allows you to create the patterns with which you're going to build this thing, because there's a lot in there and you need those patterns.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Another one for you. Can you shed some more light on cloud agnostic, please?
I think it's always a bit of a utopian dream that you can just deploy in Azure and then you fed up with Azure and move to AWS. It doesn't always work that well. I think you'd have to have a really good reason to be cloud agnostic to start with, but I think a lot of the principles are still the same. And you start to see more and more technologies that enable you to become cloud agnostic. So for example, if you're building containers to house your solutions, in theory, you can deploy your container to any cloud then. If you're deploying using Terraform, then in theory, you notice I caveat a lot of stuff with in theory. In theory, you can use Terraform to deploy into any cloud. So you can start to be more agnostic. But then if you're using Azure Monitor for logging, for example, then you're starting to tie yourself in just a bit. And if you're thinking about subscriptions and resource groups, then you're starting to tie yourself in just a bit. So I always think it's this utopian dream that I wouldn't try to achieve. I'd try to make your solutions as portable as possible.
I've always sort of the genericity versus specificity is interesting. Genericity costs so much more in reality. The example I give to people is the space shuttle versus the Apollo mission. The Apollo mission did one thing really, really well. It got to the moon. That was its only need to do, and that's all it was geared to do. The space shuttle cost immensely more because it was generic. And the idea was to repeat over and over again. And NASA ended up getting rid of it because it was too expensive to be that generic. You've got to work out what your balance is. Personally, I wanted to use things like API management, which is great in Azure, and because I needed to have that ability to open my APIs up. So I'm tying myself in because I wanted to use that specific tool. But yeah, so Docker is a fantastic technology, and make use of it, really do. But know that it costs money, and there is costs associated with it within the various platforms.
Great, thank you. Main features on Azure that you can't do without?
App Insights. Just for the amazing diagrams, if nothing else. It is such an amazing tool. I can't tell you how good it is and how many times it's saved teams that I've been working with Bacon because it just gives you such a great understanding of what's happening. Just amazing.
Yeah, I'd agree.
What else other than that? What would you say?
For me, most of my customers want to integrate with Office and the Office 365, which I hated when it came out, and I just disliked, and I wanted to use Google Docs more and more. But the Office suite is brilliant, and I need to open up. It opens up so many avenues, especially to do with single sign-on, and especially with, so for instance, one of our plans is to hook up the various ADs and allow the customer, so I can get rid of the having them to write user profiles and user user roles and security roles. I'm just going to go with AD. It's so much easier.
Yeah, it's one of the things when we talked about kind of people moving clouds, it's another one of the comments that people who move from AWS into Azure make is Active Directory and security that you have access to. Because they've done an amazing job at taking an on-premise Active Directory into the cloud, but then just rolling that through Azure and through single sign-on into other applications is brilliant. It really is.
And for me, hooking up with other organizations' ADs and allowing them in, that security is brilliant.
Great. Next one, biggest mistakes.
My team decided to put the tenancy in mutualvision.co.uk for a SaaS-based system. Luckily, I caught it. It was like, I'm sorry, what are you doing? You want to ensure that and that's why I emphasize tenancy and designing that tenancy. Don't just dump it all in one place.
I'm trying to think, to be honest. I try not to touch anything where I can make a mistake. I tend to try and draw diagrams and write documents. It's much easier. It's much safer.
Is there a mistake that you've maybe seen, Richard, that an organisation's been implementing that you've seen and you thought, what is happening here?
Yeah, I mean, the usual big mistake where you kind of, you do an intake of breath is that people don't realise that when you're creating things in a cloud, they're usually public on the internet. They don't kind of realize that. So, oh, great, I've got a new VM and it's up there. And people like to try and hack things in Azure because they know, where they are. They know what RDP ports are because it's always the same. SSH ports are. So they'll just immediately start to batter it and try and get in. And it goes back to kind of thinking about your security up front and how you want to deploy this stuff. But yeah, the usual one is you go into an organization and look at what they've got and you kind of go, we probably want to make some quick changes here.
One of the things in that area I've seen is serverless functions, which are brilliant. Love them, be it in AWS or Microsoft, but they're just open. Anybody can try and run them. You do not want that.
Great. I think we've got time for one more, which is so the final question is what do you not need to automate? So what do you not need to automate?
I have a rule. If you do something once, that's fine. If you do it twice, automate it. Because if you do it twice, you're going to do it a third time and a fourth time. So in a way, you can't afford to not automate anything. You have to automate everything you want to.
Yeah, I mean,
I do it multiple times.
I'd agree with that, and I think one of the things, particularly because I move around a lot, I think one of the things I never try to do is have tacit knowledge that I'm taking out of a business. It's in my head only. And you're either doing one of two things: you're writing it down to become stale, and people won't update it or don't know it exists, or you put it into some kind of process that's automated, in which case everybody knows it's there and it can be understood and changed. So I'm a big fan of trying to automate everything.